Hello, this is arplenoon, also known as Phoenix, back with another chapter of the Bridge Jumpers. This time it is chapter 4. This will be a casual reading, so if I make any mistakes, there will be no editing. I'm just doing this all in one go. If you would like to read this fan fiction or any of my AU fan fictions for Undertale, please go to archiveofourown.org, also known as AO3, and search for arplenoon. Alright, let's get started. Summary. One of Nightmare Sans' spies sends him a report of a Papyrus who knows more than he should. Meanwhile, a 17-year-old PaperJam Sans gets a text from Error Sans, finally agreeing to meet. The scrawny bear monster had trailed after the two papyruses as quietly as he could. Stopping, he hid behind a tree a few yards off from the ash-blighted spot in the woods where they stood. The larger embraced the smaller before he, too, hugged back and cried. Cringing, the monster ducked back behind the trunk and continued to text his boss what he overheard. He tried listening, but didn't hear anything more of interest. He'd sneak away before they realized they'd been followed. Now is the winter of our discontent. Actually, let me retry this one. Now is the winter of our discontent. I am curtailed of a man's fair proportion, cheated of further by dissembling nature. Why did I try Shakespeare? Why did I add Shakespeare? Anyway, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made. Then since this is the earth afforded no joy to me, I'll climb betimes without remorse or dread, and my first step shall be on my brother's head. Some roots were new, some were old, and those eldest, most dead, shared the same magic that flowed in his bones and in his poison. But all were polluted by his influence, years of hatred and wrath finally now bearing such brilliant crimson fruit. Oh, how refreshing, his mind filled with elation for the coming harvest. So tempted by the red, Nightmare reached to pull one of the apples. Just one, though unripe, let me taste one. Master, the latest report from Omega, said one of the dark fae, bringing a printed copy to him. He groaned, begrudged to be distracted from his fancies. Hanging from within the roots, Nightmare sent his own root to snatch the paper away and bring it up to read. As his black poison soaked the white, Nightmare read through the various bullet points of his spies. A report concerning two papyruses caught his eye. Escaped the multiverse. Centralized reality coil. Now, where had he heard that before? Ah, yes, several years ago, Error had gotten tired of his arts and crafts and actually started researching something useful. One of the past versions of murder had gathered it before dusting in an accident. But he made sure the next iteration remembered. Nightmare grinned. Servant, send a spy to the anti-void. I want to be informed the moment Error's defenses show any weakness. If his bones weren't made from a metaphysical gel, they'd be rattled. Ever since he understood Error was also his father, PaperJam wanted to meet him. Well, he had met him a few times before. Not really. There were a few encounters in his early childhood with the glitchy sands. Mostly Error just ignored or avoided them. At first, he believed when Error referred to him as an abomination. But his father Ink tried to reassure him that it wasn't personal. Oh, Error says that about everyone. I'm sure he'll eventually warm up to you. Well, PaperJam and his brother were turning 18 soon. 18. He'd be considered an adult, and he still hadn't had a civil conversation with Error. Before his 16th birthday, he sent a text to his wayward father, asking if he'd like to talk, but there was no reply. He couldn't blame Error. PaperJam had learned that he and his brother were created by accident from the clashing of Ink and Error's magic in a battle. Anyone would be in their right to be unsettled by that. And yet, PaperJam would wake from his cot from a notification on his phone. It was Error. He sat up quickly in the darkness of the doodle sphere to read it over. I'm ready to talk, if you still want that. PJ's fingers trembled as he texted back quickly. Of course, when is the best time for you? Currently, Fresh was off trying to find the whereabouts of Ink, who had been missing for 6 months. It wasn't unusual for Ink to disappear for long periods of time, but this long made them all especially concerned. Even with that, Fresh would be busy picking up Pallet and Lux from their regular visits that day, and their father's young apprentice, Template, who should have been on guard, snored away fast asleep. PJ grabbed his bag, paints, and brushes before slipping out of the darkened doodle sphere and into the anti-void. He followed the information provided by Error and hanging out until the set time of his wayward father's choosing. Given he'd practically been raised in the anti-void, it wasn't hard for PJ to fall back asleep, floating and waiting. The buzzing of his phone shot him awake again. We're ready when you are. A red apartment door appeared before him, labeled 000. As he landed in front of it, PJ trembled and gripped the sling of his satchel. Was this really happening? The last time he'd seen Era was nearly 7 years ago. Back then, Era was fleeing from Ink, who stopped him from destroying an AU. This really could be a trap. The moment he stepped through that door, he'd be completely at Era's mercy. And yet, PaperJam felt so desperate to finally have a father in his life who might not disappear for days or weeks on end without notice. It was then that PJ heard the music. Pressing the side of his skull to the door, a soft jazz echoed, along with the clinking of plates, along with the low murmur of Era's voice. Taking a deep breath, tense shoulders, he tried the handle and pushed open. 4 brick walls stood before PJ, surrounded by potted plants and a carpet of green grass. Housed in glass were several antiques and textile artwork, including the infamous dolls Error was known to create. Large factory-style windows let natural light in as ghostly images of people passed by on the street, moved over the glass. A small skeleton girl ran up to him, not a Sans or a Papyrus. She wore a green sweater, looking up at him and signed, "Hello, Mr. PJ. I'm Cambria." The lack of a lower jaw explained her method of communication. His jaw hung ajar before he looked past her. There stood Error, calmly with his hands in front of him, wearing a kimono. His practiced expression calm, but even PJ could see how he nervously gripped his hands together. "It's nice to finally meet you, PaperJam," he spoke softly. "We've met before," PJ said, unthinking. They had met once when he was very small. PJ and Gradient had run off from the doodle sphere to explore an AU on their own, accidentally jumping in during a genocide route. PJ couldn't remember all the details. Era had followed them, catching them in strings before returning them to the anti-void. Era hesitated before Cambria signed, "Era made breakfast. It's crepes. I've never had them before, but they're French. Come on, let's have some." Oh, all right," he said as Cambria grabbed at his coat, pulling him toward the table. "Mind your manners," said Era gently, also signing the words, as Cambria came to sit next to him. In the middle of the space was a long, low table covered in a blue tablecloth. There were 3 seat cushions just before them. A platter of fresh fruit crepes, steamed, and jars of juice sat on the table. The skeleton girl signed her apology, but she looked far too excited to sit still for long. "A child?" was the next thing PaperJam could utter, hoping the words were enough to convey his question. "Yes, this is Cambria, my foster daughter. I don't plan on keeping her here, if that's what you're wondering," said Error. "How long has she been here?" he asked, as the girl proceeded to fill her plate with a pastry and fruits. Error paused as he pulled a crepe onto his own plate. "About a month now, if I recall correctly." That was something of a relief. At least Error hadn't been raising a child while rejecting the 2 children who wanted to know him. The awkward pause seemed to grant permission for Cambria to interact. "So you're Ink's son. Error talks about Ink all the time. What's he like?" "I do not talk about Ink all the time," Error groaned. signing with just as much irritation before rolling his eyes. Cambria's eye socket smiled as she met PJ's gaze. "He does," she signed. PJ couldn't help but grin, his shoulders relaxing. Uh, he's very busy. I don't get to spend time with him as much as I like to. He's been missing for some time, at least from what I can tell, correct? Asked Error after he took a bite. It gave PaperJam pause. No, he didn't just call me here for information on ink, did he? Yes, he has. I'm sorry, that can't be... That must not be easy for you. How's Gradient? I haven't heard anything of him. Oh, he's fine. Gradient prefers to keep to his own, said PJ. Awkwardly, he cleared his throat and pulled a crepe onto his plate before taking a bite. Flavorful and flaky, PJ was surprised by the quality of the breakfast. Oh wow, this is pretty good. You made this? Well, not physically. I manipulated the code to perfection, Era said with a smile with pride. Era is a very good cook. He makes everything for me, including my clothes, Cambria signed after the small bite from her fork disappeared in her mouth. Where did you find Cambria? PJ asked. I found her in an incomplete AU. I originally planned to leave her in the anti-void to be rescued by Core's team, but the condition she was in, she wouldn't have survived. So, you did keep your promise to Ink. I heard your first truce was not to create or destroy anything anymore. However, that seemed too much for Dad. You made different truce some years ago. Aaron nodded. Ink promised to avoid the creation of anything duplicitous, incomplete, or lacking. I, in turn, would not destroy any AUs that proved unique, interesting, or the souls proved valuable. I'd expect you to know from the number of survivors I've left. Yes, well, I think most survivors have more to say about you destroying their world than sparing their lives. PJ feared he might have overstepped as Cambria went quiet, looking at Error. However, Error shrugged. Understandable. Does this mean you finally want to be a father to me and Gradient? He said. PJ folded his arms, leaning back. Because Gradient and I will be 18 soon. You're a bit late. Well, Error lowered his hands and hesitated. It seems hypocritical to have Cambria's company and not speak to you. So it's a matter of pride for you. All of them went quiet. Error frowned and sighed. PaperJam furrowed his brow, realizing he'd let his own frustration get between them. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. You didn't have a choice. Growing up, Ink told us so much about you, and knowing you were there but didn't want us. Error shook his head slowly and looked at PJ. I was a different skeleton several years ago. By the time I changed, I thought it was too late to have a relationship with you two. PaperJam knew he'd already forgiven Error, so there was no use in feeling hurt about it. Well, I'm glad, truly, that you invited me, and I do still want to get to know you. I'm sure Gradient would like to meet you too. A soft smile came to Error. I'd like that. I want to meet him too, and Ink, and all the Star Sanses, sighed Cambria. Grinning, PJ nodded. I'm sure that can be arranged. Wait, all the Star Sanses? Error said, his whole body flickered. Yeah, why not? Said PJ. Error cleared his throat. No, it's fine, he said, and took a sip of juice. If you're worried they'd capture you, I can assure you they won't. I give my word. I wouldn't let them hold you against your will. It's not that. I've met with the Star Sanses before. We've even formed alliances when it came to keeping Nightmare under control. It's just most meetings usually devolve into arguing about my role as a destroyer. I've explained my reasons 100 times, and agreeing to meet you doesn't change my feelings about what I do. Oh, I see. But if you've changed, then why do you still destroy AUs? I know you've left survivors, but you've still killed millions of people. PJ could see Era swallow nervously before taking a deep breath. I doubt Ink has done much to explain. The thing is, the way our multiverse works isn't how it should be. There's some unnatural influence that acts upon it, causes it to grow like a cancer. Granted, over the years it's stabilized, but the cancer doesn't go away. My job remains important for the sanity of everyone. I admit, this wasn't my motivation. This wasn't my motivation in the beginning. I was young, full of rage and sorrow. I destroyed and tortured on impulse. But as I dealt with my circumstances, I realized what I did actually helped our multiverse grow stronger, not weaker. Those souls and worlds that could survive proved worthy to stand on their own. There's no one who does what I do, at least sanely. Should I stop? Should I stop, places like the Omega timeline would overflow into chaos. I take pride in my work, regardless of how my morals are questioned. That made a lot of sense. No wonder no one ever told PJ that. The thought that erasing could actually be a good thing. It sounded insane, upside down, backwards. Even though he had suspected as such, Error's role prevented their worlds from falling into chaos. There is one thing I would like to know about Ink, said Error, bringing PJ back to the moment. What is he, exactly? What do you mean? I mean, how is he capable to create without a soul? I know that the vials he carries allows him to have emotions, but that doesn't explain how he's even able to hold a physical form. Well, just about every version of Flowey doesn't have a soul. But Flowey is magic possessing a pre-existing life form, a flower. Ink is a monster without a soul. Ink is a monster without a soul, which shouldn't be possible. And if I did know, how do I know you wouldn't use this information to harm him? Said PJ, folding his arms again. Please. I accepted long ago that whatever Ink is, I can't defeat him. He's holding back. And if he didn't refuse to kill, I'd be long dead. In short, no, I don't know what he is. I didn't come here to talk about Ink. I came to talk about us. Like, for example, if I can call you Dad, and if you're going to accept me and Gradient as your sons. The glitching lines around Aaron made PJ realize he may have overstepped again. Awkwardly, he waited as the rebooting bar appeared over Error. The two children looked at each other, Cambria snickering. PaperJam was about to laugh himself when he felt something brush his leg. Hard and wet, it sent a shiver up his spine. The table was thrown. Grabbed by his leg, PJ was thrust into the air. Cambria wheezed in fright. He briefly glanced as Error stood, grabbing Cambria with his strings and flinging her through a portal. As for PJ, his whole body became wrapped in an uncomfortable cocoon of decaying roots. Error! He cried before his jaw was clamped shut by a root, his soul skipping several beats as he realized what was happening. Nightmare. The black skeleton floated beside him. His glowing violet eye pierced PJ's mind, along with that sadistic grin. Error strings flew to cut Nightmare, when the tentacles twisted PJ's neck painfully. PJ yelped in pain. Another move and I'll snap your precious son's neck, Nightmare hummed. Father and son meeting at last. Adorable. How did he get in the door? Aaron must have been so anxious to meet him, he forgot to cloak the location from intruders. PJ imagined that fear hadn't crossed the old skeleton's mind in many years. PJ imagined that fear hadn't crossed the old skeleton's face in many years, but the expression Error held was nothing short of true terror. Good. I have your attention, Nightmare grinned. So I'll make this brief. A little bird overheard a Papyrus in the OT speaking of the centralized reality coil. If memory serves me correctly, that was a term you coined, my dear Error. I'd really like to know how this Papyrus managed to find out about it. Error's voice growled in a white noise. Go to hell. Well, at least not until I send your son there first. PJ screamed as he felt his head wrenched further. Stop! Wait! I don't know what's in the OT. You know this, Error pleaded. Tears fell from PJ's sockets as he looked at his father. He tried to reach his paintbrushes in his satchel, but his arms were tangled up, too. I don't want to die. Not only that, if Nightmare killed PJ, Error would be blamed. His truce with ink would be broken in the most bitter way possible. Error breathed heavily, trying not to glitch out from sheer anxiety. Please, don't hurt him. Why does this even matter? Now that's the language I like to hear. It matters because this papyrus is trying to escape the reality coil. The reality coil. Escape the multiverse, along with others. Nightmare put a hand to his chin and crossed his legs where he floated. A little while back, Hassan's passed away, but it didn't feel like a normal death to me. His soul didn't shatter. It was taken outside the scope of reality. Normally, this wouldn't be an issue. But if my theory is correct, if too many souls escape at once, it'll only merge our multiverses with another, which means an insane amount of work for you. Before long, this papyrus is going to end up making a death cult. Error hung his head. If this is a ploy to get me to join you, it won't work. If what you say does happen, I'll deal with it in time. Will you now? Well, I suppose I could just do this the old-fashioned way and keep your son a prisoner in my castle. He's got an enjoyable scream, don't you think? I can make you listen to it every time you disobey me. Suddenly, green strings shot out and shredded at the tentacles holding PJ. He gasped, falling, but made himself float before hitting the ground. Error acted fast, pulling his own strings to attack Nightmare, but the decaying bundle of roots laughed, disappearing through a portal. Coughing, PaperJam held his throat. Gradient appeared, running into the room, green strings dangling from his fingers. He ran to PJ's side to help. Error quickly pulled up a screen, typing in a code to lock down the area before running to kneel at PJ's side. The concern in Error's eyes couldn't be anything less than genuine. I'm fine. I'll be fine. He cleared his throat. PaperJam, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for that to happen. It's all right. It was an accident, said PJ, turning to sit down, looking around at the mess of their breakfast scattered around the apartment. What? Why was he here? Centralized reality coil? What does that mean? Error took a breath. He sat back on the floor, rubbing his face. It's a fancy term to describe our multiverse. It explains why AUs appear It explains why AUs appear that resemble elements we already recognize. Over 2 decades ago, I came in contact with a Swamp River person living at the very edge of our known multiverse. I was going to destroy them, but their resolve for survival impressed me. They hadn't entered the multiverse, but already had theories about it. We worked together briefly, which helped me realize that ink wasn't completely responsible for every AU that appeared. I wouldn't doubt Nightmare hacked my records, but they're the only person who knew that term. I hadn't spoken to them for so long. That AU was corrupted and I destroyed it about 6 months ago. His eyes widened in realization before his expression softened. I only spared one soul, a papyrus. I left him to be rescued. Oh, that was a lot of information to take in at once. The three of them fell silent before Error shook his head. I'm sorry. I completely ruined our breakfast. You should get back to the Jewel Spear before anyone worries about you. Are you sure? Will you be all right? Error nodded slowly, too ashamed to meet his gaze. I'll be all right. You're not safe here if Nightmare intends to use you against me.